She was an assassin sent to kill me, but her plans changed when she saw my big. The thermal dampeners on the Aegis Station hummed a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soles of Asher's boots. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling viewport, watching the swirling gases of the nebula outside, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the darkened room. He knew someone was behind him because the air pressure in the room had shifted by a fraction of a percent when the vent cover moved. Humans were often mocked for their sensitive skin and erratic nervous systems, but that same sensitivity allowed him to feel the slight draft of an intruder. He did not turn around immediately, instead choosing to take a slow sip of his drink, the amber liquid catching the light of distant stars. He felt the cold tip of a vibrating blade press against the column of his throat. "You should have locked the secondary maintenance hatch," a melodic, icy voice whispered. Liara stepped into the faint light, her azure skin shimmering with a faint bioluminescence that traced the lean, powerful muscles of her frame. She was an elite shadow walker, her species designed for the vacuum of space and the silence of the kill. Her yellow eyes narrowed, searching for the terror that should have been radiating from the human. Instead, she found only a steady pulse beating against her blade, a rhythm that was strangely calm and resonant. "The hatch is broken, and I was too busy fixing the gravity well for your people to worry about a lock," Asher said, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated through Liara's arm. "You speak as if you have a choice in your survival," Liara said, her grip tightening on the hilt of the dagger. "I always have a choice," Asher said, turning his head just enough to meet her gaze, the metal scraping his skin but not breaking it. The human did not flinch, his eyes tracing the intricate markings on Liara's face with a curiosity that felt like a physical touch. She felt a strange heat emanating from him, a caloric output that exceeded anything her species was capable of maintaining. He was a walking furnace of biological energy, and the proximity was starting to make her own blood cycle faster. She had been told humans were soft, fragile creatures that relied on machines to survive the harshness of the void. Yet, as she stood inches from him, she saw the dense layering of muscle in his chest and the calloused texture of his hands. He looked like a being built for endurance and physical labor, an evolutionary masterpiece of terrestrial survival. "Your heart is accelerating," Liara said, trying to regain her professional distance. "That is because you are beautiful, not because I am afraid," Asher said, a small smirk playing on his lips. "Flattery is a poor shield against a T-Wrath blade," Liara said, though she did not pull the trigger on the blade's sonic pulse. "It is not a shield, it is an observation," Asher said, stepping closer into the blade rather than away from it. The move caught her off guard, forcing her to retract the weapon to avoid accidentally ending the conversation too soon. He reached out, his hand moving with a steady, deliberate pace that allowed her every opportunity to strike. He didn't grab her, he simply rested his palm against the cool silk of her shoulder armor. The heat from his hand soaked through the composite plating, hitting her skin like a sunburst. Her species lived in the shadows of gas giants, craving any scrap of warmth they could find. The sheer intensity of his body temperature was intoxicating, a biological luxury she had never experienced. "Why are you really here, Liara?" Asher asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "To stop the human encroachment on the Veil Nebula," Liara said, her voice wavering for the first time. "We are not encroaching. We are building a life support bridge for your colonies," Asher said, walking toward a holographic terminal in the center of the room. "The High Council says you are building a weapon to crack our moons," Liara said, following him with her blade still drawn. "Look at the data," Asher said, gesturing to the shimmering blue blueprints that erupted from the floor. The complexity of the calculations was staggering, a web of gravitational physics that sought to stabilize the decaying orbit of her home world. It was a project of immense scale, requiring the kind of long-term planning and resource management that most alien races found exhausting. To humans, it was just another engineering problem to be solved with sweat and stubbornness. Liara stared at the flickering lines, her mind racing to find the deception, but the math was honest. It was a gift of survival, wrapped in the audacity of human ambition. She looked back at the man who had designed it, seeing him not as a target, but as a creator. "You would do this for us," Liara asked, the dagger lowering toward her hip. We do it because we can, and because the galaxy is too quiet without neighbors, Asher said, stepping into her personal space. The air between them was thick with tension, a mix of lethal intent and a growing, undeniable attraction. Liara felt the urge to strike, not to kill, but to touch the source of the heat that was now radiating through her entire body. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, marveling at the coarseness of his stubble. Humans were so tactile, so driven by the senses that other races had long since dulled in the name of efficiency. He caught her wrist, his grip firm but gentle, pulling her hand toward his chest. Feel that, Asher said, pressing her palm over his heart. It is so loud, Liara whispered, her breath hitching in her throat. That is the sound of a species that refuses to give up, Asher said, his other hand sliding around her waist. He pulled her flush against him, the contrast between her cool skin and his burning frame causing a literal puff of condensation to form in the air. Liara gasped, her legs feeling heavy as the pheromones humans dumped into the air began to cloud her judgment. It was a biological chemical war, and she was losing. She dropped the dagger, the clatter of metal on the deck plating echoing through the silent room. She didn't care about the mission anymore. She only cared about the way his thumb was tracing circles on the small of her back. I should kill you for what you are doing to my mind, Liara said, her voice dropping to a sultry growl. You can try later, Asher said, his head dipping down to find the sensitive curve of her neck. His lips were soft, but his intent was hard, a predatory focus that shifted from engineering to conquest in a heartbeat. He tasted like salt and the expensive bourbon he had been drinking, a combination that made Liara's head swim. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her claws digging slightly into his shoulders, but he didn't pull away. He seemed to relish the slight sting. His hands moving down to grasp her hips and lift her onto the edge of the holographic terminal. The blueprints of a sun-saver flickered around them, bathing their joined forms in a ghostly blue light. Your people told me humans were weak, Liara said, her breath hot against his ear. They forgot to mention we have more stamina than a fusion core, Asher said, his hands moving to the fastens of her suit. He worked the seals with a practiced ease, his fingers moving with a dexterity that spoke of years spent handling delicate machinery. As the suit peeled away, revealing the lithe, athletic curves of her body, Asher let out a low whistle of appreciation. She was a vision of alien grace, her skin patterned with darker swirls that pulsed with her heartbeat. He didn't look at her like a scientist studying a specimen. He looked at her like a man who had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle. You are a marvel of evolution, Asher whispered, his hands roaming over her ribs. And you are a fire that I want to jump into, Liara said, pulling his shirt over his head. The sight of his torso made her pulse spike, the heavy slabs of muscle, and the map of scars telling a story of a life lived on the edge of survival. He was rugged, a stark contrast to the refined, almost fragile aesthetic of her own kind. She ran her hands over his chest, feeling the density of his bones and the power coiled in his frame. When he pressed her back against the terminal, the cold metal of the desk was a sharp contrast to the heat of his body, driving her senses into a frenzy. Show me this human endurance, Liara said, her voice a challenge. Careful what you wish for, assassin, Asher said, his eyes darkening with a raw, primal hunger. He didn't hold back, his movements a blend of power and a surprising tenderness that kept her on the edge of a breakdown. Every touch was an exploration, every kiss a claim. He moved with a rhythm that felt like the tide, relentless and all-consuming. Liara found herself making sounds she didn't know her vocal cords could produce, a series of high-pitched chirps and low moans that filled the room. The human was tireless, his body a machine designed for the singular purpose of providing pleasure and receiving it in return. He knew exactly where to press, how to move, and when to hold her still, his intuition for her biology reaching beyond any manual she had ever read. I can't think, Liara cried out, her head tossing back. Don't think, just feel, Asher said, his voice a rough command. He drove her toward a peak that felt like a star-going supernova, his own breath coming in ragged gasps that synced with her own. When the release finally came, it was violent and beautiful, a total system collapse that left them both shivering in the aftermath. Liara clung to him, her skin slick with a mixture of their sweat, her heart finally finding a rhythm that matched his. They stayed like that for a long time, the holographic star system still spinning slowly above them, a silent witness to their union. "Your species is dangerous," Liara said, her voice trembling as she recovered. "We are just passionate," Asher said, kissing her forehead. "No, it is more than that. You change everything you touch," Liara said, looking at the terminal. "I want to change the future of the T-Wrath," Asher said, sitting up and pulling her into his lap. "The Council will not listen to an assassin who failed her mark," Liara said, her eyes darkening with worry. "They will listen to the woman who brings them the key to their survival," Asher said, tapping a command into the console. A small data chip popped out of the side of the terminal, glowing with an orange light. He handed it to her, his expression turning serious. It contained the final phase of the project, a way to jumpstart the core of their home world using human-designed kinetic siphons. It was technology that the T-Wrath had deemed a fantasy, something that required a level of risk-taking they simply didn't possess. Humans, however, were born of risk. They were a species that had crawled off a death world and decided to claim the stars, and they were more than happy to share the secret of their success with anyone brave enough to listen. "This is treason for me to take," Liara said, even as her fingers closed around the chip. "It is evolution," Asher said, standing up and helping her dress. "Why would you give this to me after I tried to kill you?" Liara asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Because a galaxy where you don't exist is a galaxy I don't want to live in," Asher said, his voice soft but certain. The sincerity in his words was more powerful than any weapon she had ever carried. She realized then that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their ships or their guns, but their capacity for empathy and their refusal to accept the inevitable. They looked at a dying star and saw a renovation project. They looked at an assassin and saw a partner. Liara stepped into her suit, the armor feeling heavy and restrictive now that she knew the freedom of his touch. She checked her chronometer. The extraction team would be arriving at the outer hull in minutes. "I have to go," Liara said, her eyes lingering on his. "I know," Asher said, leaning against the viewport. "Will I see you again?" Liara asked, her hand resting on the airlock controls. "When the first siphon starts, I'll be there to oversee the installation," Asher said, a confident grin returning to his face. "I will be waiting," Liara said, her voice filled with a new kind of resolve. She vanished into the shadows of the maintenance duct as quickly as she had arrived, leaving behind only the faint scent of her bioluminescence and the lingering heat on Asher's skin. He turned back to the viewport, watching the dark shape of a stealth craft detach from the station and disappear into the nebula. He knew the path ahead would be difficult. The High Council would be furious, the human government would demand explanations, and the galaxy at large would be terrified of the new alliance. But as he felt the steady, powerful thrum of his own heart, he knew they would succeed. The next few months were a blur of diplomatic cables and clandestine meetings. Asher worked 18-hour days, pushing his engineering teams to the limit to produce the kinetic siphons. He faced assassination attempts from his own side, people who feared that giving the T-Wrath such power would shift the balance of the sector. But every time he felt the weight of the task, he remembered the way Liara's eyes had changed when she saw the truth. He remembered the heat of their connection and the way she had looked at him, not as a monster, but as a savior. The day of the activation arrived with a tension that gripped the entire sector. Asher stood on the bridge of the human lead ship, the Indomitable, as it hovered over the T-Wrath home world. Below them, the massive siphons were embedded in the planetary crust, glowing with a fierce white light. On the screen, the T-Wrath High Council watched with bated breath, their cold, calculating faces etched with a rare display of hope. Beside the High Admiral stood Liara, her posture rigid and professional, but her eyes were fixed on the human ship with an intensity that Asher could feel even through the vacuum of space. "Initiate sequence," Asher commanded, his hand hovering over the final engagement button. "The thermal loads are exceeding safety parameters," an officer called out. "Humans don't play it safe," Asher said, slamming his hand down. A massive beam of energy shot from the Indomitable, striking the primary siphon. The planet groaned, a deep, subsonic vibration that rattled the teeth of every being in the system. For a moment, it seemed as if the world would crack under the pressure, the sheer magnitude of the human engineering project pushing the limits of physics. Then, the glow shifted from a volatile white to a steady, rhythmic blue. The core of the planet had caught the spark. The dying world began to warm, its magnetic field stabilizing for the first time in centuries. A cheer erupted on the T-Rath bridge, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that was completely alien to their culture. "It worked," Liara whispered, her image on the screen blurring as she stepped closer to the camera. "Of course it did," Asher said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and pride. "The Council wishes to speak with you regarding a permanent alliance," Liara said, her professional mask slipping to reveal a brief, private smile. "Tell them I'm on my way down," Asher said, his eyes locking onto hers. As his shuttle descended through the newly stabilized atmosphere, Asher felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. He was entering a world that had once tried to kill him, but he was doing so as an equal and a friend. The humans had done what the rest of the galaxy thought was a waste of time. They had saved a race that didn't know how to save itself. And in doing so, they had found a place for themselves in the stars that was built on more than just conquest. The shuttle doors hissed open to reveal a landing pad crowded with T-Rath officials, but Asher only had eyes for one. Liara stood at the front of the line, her armor polished and her head held high. As he stepped onto the soil of her world, she broke protocol, walking forward to meet him before the officials could speak. She didn't offer a salute or a formal greeting. She reached out and took his hand, her cool fingers intertwining with his warm ones. "Welcome home, Asher," Liara said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's good to be here, Liara," Asher said, pulling her close for a moment that ignored the eyes of two civilizations. The galaxy changed that day. It wasn't the weapons or the wars that redefined the future, but the human capacity to look at a problem and see a possibility. They had brought fire to a cold world and passion to a cold race. As they walked toward the council chambers, hand in hand, the people of the T-Rath looked on in awe at the strange, resilient creatures from Earth. They were loud, they were messy, and they were dangerously ambitious. But they were exactly what the galaxy needed to survive the long night. Asher squeezed Liara's hand, feeling the steady pulse of a world reborn, and he knew that this was only the beginning of their story.